If I could link, in the minds of the British people, immigration with membership of the European Union, then everything would change.
We haven't got enough houses now as it is, so where are you going to put them?
Just remember how many immigrants, like my family, like a lot of the people in this audience's family, have built this nation.
The problem has been that immigrants, asylum seekers, have all been confused in the popular mind.
Anti-immigration groups were behind disturbances in several English towns and cities last night. One of the protesters told me the country was full and foreigners were the problem.
The idea that we had some sort of open-door immigration policy is just absolute nonsense.
We wanted to see strict limits at a scale that was not going to disturb the nature of our very historic and peaceful country.
What I saw was the tabloid press becoming unhinged about this issue.
British jobs for British workers.
Net immigration in the tens of thousands.
My promise to you, to stop the boats.
There is a pervasive view that more immigration is better for the country.
It was too high, it wasn't being controlled, it needed to be controlled.
The fact is we're not in control of it, and to say otherwise is misleading the public.
I'm Craig Oliver. I was Director of Politics and Communications at number 10 Downing Street. There was a huge amount of polling about what was going on in the country and what issues did people consider to be the most important. And every week, bar one, immigration was at the top of that list. It was a huge issue. David Cameron felt that it was his duty as Prime Minister to address that issue, which is where his pledge to get net migration down to the tens of thousands came from.
One of the aims of my government was that we should have an economy that can function and grow and become more productive without mass migration every year. In 2010, 2011, 2012, we were getting net migration down. We were making progress.
The Conservatives have adopted this slogan. We're clearly not going to meet it. They felt very vulnerable politically because of it. And the response was to become, in some cases, more rationally restrictive, in other cases, completely irrational and damaging. But we saw an element of panic.
Theresa May and David Cameron wanted to bring together all the different departments to come up with policies that would be as hostile as possible for immigrants who they didn't want to be in the country. From where I was sitting, it felt like a lot to do with appealing to the right of a political party.
The idea of having a sort of internal border where you check whether people who are using public services are actually in the country legitimately, that is a very sensible policy, and that wasn't in any way a reaction to anything else that was going on.
Theresa May, we're going to give illegal migrants a really hostile reception. It's an interview in the Daily Telegraph.
The Immigration Minister, Damien Green, said he was working closely with other government departments to create a hostile environment for migrants to live in the UK illegally.
It's a get-tough policy, finding suspected illegal immigrants and removing them.
So we've got a warrant to be on the premises, okay?
The words that were attached to it of hostile environment were a bad idea. But the fundamental thinking behind it was that when people who are here illegally want to live in social housing or want to use the health service or other public services, you identify whether or not they have a right to be here.
This turned ordinary people, landlords, into immigration officers. This, turned employers into immigration officers. The impact on migrants of those policies was huge. People stopped actually renting to migrants, even those who have status, who have visas, because they're not immigration officers. They can't tell. They did not want to take the risk.
It basically brought an awful lot of people into the arm of enforcement.
I remember arriving at Finsbury Park Station one evening, and suddenly the place is full of immigration officers, stopping people randomly. Who were they stopping? Asian people, African people, Caribbean people.
It was always obvious that the hostile environment was never going to just affect a very small group of people. People of colour, that they were treated as foreigners, and often that assumption that they were migrants or foreigners was initially based on skin colour.
The phrase hostile environment was used inside the Home Office specifically about illegal immigrants who had no right to be here, and it was one of those phrases where political opponents managed to distort it in a fairly successful way.
How do you spot an illegal immigrant? In London, it's probably nigh on impossible. The government says this pilot poster campaign will target illegal immigrants.
This is just the latest in a series of immigration initiatives.
I think it's a fantastic idea. We need to clean up the mess because it's creating a lot of problems here. And also the people who are legally entitled to work are being deprived of jobs.
When I saw that van, actually I saw it on the street, my heart sank. We felt so low, so depressed. It took us by surprise how low a government could actually go. And because all of us migrants, we lived here for many, many years. We should feel British. We felt this is targeting us.
This area, I've always said about immigration, is what is required is calm and moderate and sensible language and tough, robust action. And all too often in British politics, you've had tough language and weak action. You got it the wrong way around.
There was always a tension between David Cameron and Theresa May, and there was a particular issue with her department and her special advisors, who often would do things that I think that David Cameron should have been a lot clearer about, saying, look, you shouldn't be doing this kind of thing. And sometimes things would burst into the open that we discovered had happened that we would not have sanctioned.
I don't think I was aware of the go-home vans at the time.
We ended up looking as if somehow that this was playing to the gallery rather than actually having a serious solution to a problem.
There were some returns achieved as a result of that, but I think politicians should be willing to step up to the plate and say when they think something actually hasn't been as good an idea, and I think they were too blunt an instrument.
When I first met Nigel Farage, he was a telephone call into my own home when I was watching Spooks on TV, and I remember thinking that was just a joke from my brother making up that this person was calling me, and it turned out that it was Nigel. When we met, he was affable, but there was always this sense that it was never his true self that was talking to you. I think always Nigel's main point was that he wanted to leave the European Union, and the immigration wasn't a big issue for him in so many ways. Nigel picked up on the very clear message coming from those people. that immigration was becoming a big issue in the UK. Immigration enabled Nigel then to start talking about other issues that impacted, say, poorer sectors of society. And that was the great opening gap. Without that, UKIP wouldn't have grown.
UKIP emerged as a separate political force, and were taking a position on immigration with which, of course, we agreed.
With Migration Watch being rational and logical about what the impact of this massive increase in population would mean for schools, roads, access to GPs and everything else, I think to some extent it did help to make wholesale debate amongst the British public respectable.
Nigel relied on them a lot himself. He had more private meetings with them than was allowed by people like myself. With the help of people like Andrew Green, Nigel was then able to start develop an argument that talked about EU migration and the numbers coming across. That allowed pressure onto the Conservative Party.
Why are so many foreign people entitled to benefits at all? And of course the reason is we're all members of this European Union. And now we've given them total freedom to use our benefit system, our health system, our schools. Migration Watch were a very important group. They were producing numbers. None of them were ever wrong. Their predictions were also incredibly good. That legitimised everything I stood up and say. It was important to have them there. So Migration Watch, yeah, big part in all of this.
Nigel Farage is a very, very skilled campaigner, and he very effectively used immigration as an issue and put it front and centre in terms of his aim of getting us out of the European Union.
Down every street in Eastleigh, the chase for votes continued.
So the postal vote is very important.
Squeezing every last chance to get their message across.
UKIP think they could do well, possibly come first, maybe beat the Tories to second. They've put immigration front and centre.
Thanks very much for stopping there. There needs to be a moratorium on immigration for a period of time to allow this country to absorb what is here already.
The Conservatives are deploying their big guns to try to stop that happening.
There's no doubt the Conservative Party and David Cameron had underestimated UKIP. It was clear that they were a presence and a force and a problem for the Conservative Party. That only grew over time. There was a massive pressure on David Cameron in and around Europe.
Public disillusionment with the EU is at an all-time high. That is why I am in favour of having a referendum.
Oh, there was elation that we applied pressure now on the Conservative Party, that they had actually gone so far as to say and that they needed to have a referendum, and that was a clear recognition that UKIP had come of age.
To say it was all because of pressure from UKIP, that's complete nonsense. I first started writing and thinking about the need for a sort of reset in Britain's relations with Europe in January 2012, when UKIP were barely polling. They were like 4 or 5%. So, of course, they grew, and of course I thought they were going to grow as we went into a European election in 2014, but the motivation for trying to sort out Britain's relationship with Europe was not so much about UKIP, it was more about that I thought the relationship wasn't working.
There was no way that Cameron would ever have offered a referendum had it not been for the rise in UKIP. All the press say, well, that's it, the UKIP fox has been shot. No, all he'd done was legitimise us.
Nonsense. I mean, it really is nonsense. If you read the speech, it actually barely mentions immigration at all. In fact, I don't think it does at all. It probably should have done, but it didn't.
The UK Independence Party may have come second, but those smiles tell you they think they've made the big time.
For the Conservatives, they were, I think, shocked that UKIP, who had been trying to build up hostility to immigration, effectively broke through in that by-election, and that really sent alarm bells ringing in the Tory party.
From that point onwards, there was a huge energy. And you saw then us winning seats in local elections up and down the country.
The political party, once dismissed by the Conservatives as loonies and clowns, has tonight sent a shockwave through the Westminster establishment.
We need to show respect for people who've taken the choice to support this party, and we're going to work really hard to win them back. What then happens, which I hadn't foreseen, was of course you get the Eurozone crisis.
Unemployment across the Eurozone remains stubbornly high.
In Madrid tonight, protesters clashed with the police after the announcement that unemployment had reached another record level. For those under 25, the jobless rate has reached a staggering 57%.
You get this huge influx of people coming in to take in the jobs that my government was successfully creating. The Eurozone crisis was a real setback, and that wasn't something I had predicted.
By the time we got to 2013, 2014, people had realised we didn't have any control over numbers coming into Britain whatsoever.
Our first question from Danny Rose, please.
Is it time we defied Europe and closed our borders and say we're full?
The main concern in immigration is that people come over here and they work for 3 months. Once they finish a 3-month contract, they're then out there and they claim benefits from that.
I was the Director of Strategy in Downing Street. Every weekend, we asked one completely open, unprompted question in an opinion poll of 2,000 people all over the country. And the question was, if you could raise just one issue with the Prime Minister David Cameron, what would it be? And every weekend, with one exception, that word cloud was dominated by the word immigration.
This is a leaflet that Nigel Farage's party distributed in the recent Eastleigh by-election. You may remember it. It says here that 29 million Romanians and Bulgarians may come to this country. There aren't even 29 million Romanians and Bulgarians living in Romania and Bulgaria. It is simply not true.
Nigel Farage grinning because his dream of topping a national vote came true.
It is an earthquake in British politics. It is a remarkable result, and it does have, I think, profound consequences for the leaders of the other parties.
The Conservatives have defied all the pundits and won a majority of MPs in Parliament.
Decisive, clear-cut, emphatic. This was a sensational victory for David Cameron.
UKIP took 13%, but their leader failed to win a seat.
I will now form a majority Conservative government. And yes, we will deliver that in-out referendum on our future in Europe.
If he had not said that there was going to be a referendum, Nigel Farage would have continued his march.
Hundreds of refugees poured onto the platforms. They raced towards a train. Children were hauled up into the carriage. Others climbed on the backs of those hoping to squeeze in.
Immigration came onto their public agenda very strongly, and I think a lot of that was the Syrian civil war. I think people feared that a lot of that migration ultimately was going to end up in the United Kingdom.
Groups of migrants are breaking through Calais defences using watchmen, wire cutters and force of numbers. More than 100 extra police have been brought in to help keep control, but the lure of the UK is stronger.
A lot of the concern about immigration in the country was about people from outside the European Union, but that problem got conflated with people from Eastern Europe. And so it was a debate that was not just toxic, but it was also very confusing.
I provided all of the private polling and was one of the strategy advisors to that campaign. Most people in Britain thought that the scale of people coming to the UK from the EU and the fact that we couldn't limit or control that was a problem. If that was the primary issue in their mind when they voted, we would lose.
It's getting too much. You know, there's too many people coming in.
You know, they've opened the doors, haven't they, practically?
Because there's no work for us, so how can we survive if too much people come in?
Britain's relationship with Europe is going to need to change. A renegotiation accompanied by a referendum will be necessary to get it back into place.
As David Cameron left last night, confident his reforms would make a difference, critics already claimed this deal was weak. Within hours of this crucial summit ending, it seems the referendum campaign is just starting.
I negotiated that you shouldn't get full access to the welfare system for 4 years. But it wasn't a slam dunk because it wasn't no benefits for 4 years. It was a sort of sliding scale. So it was complicated and it was second best. And so on the subject of immigration in the referendum campaign, you know, we knew we were on ground weaker than we would have liked.
It fell far, far short for anybody who was really concerned about the issue of the straightforward simplicity of take back control.
Hi, good morning. Good morning. This is a choice for a generation, potentially for a lifetime. Do we stay in or do we leave a reformed European Union?
Both sides are now stepping up their efforts to persuade you of their arguments.
David Cameron said he would get net migration down to the tens of thousands. That became a massive stick to beat him with during the referendum campaign.
The issue is an open door to 500 million people and net migration running at 1/3 people a year. And this under a Prime Minister who promised us he'd reduce migration to tens of thousands a year.
The genius of Nigel Farage was to link the most salient issue in the minds of the public, immigration, with the issue on which he was trying to wage a referendum, the European Union. And I think that linkage is very, very skillfully done.
When we were talking about Britain's access to the single market and how it was good for business and good for jobs, when we were talking about that, we were winning. And when we were talking about immigration and the fact that with free movement of people, you couldn't effectively control who was coming into your country, we were losing.
Because this whole debate is about democracy. Our ability to speak out. And we won't be drowned out, will we?
I think it definitely made the task of the Remain campaign harder, that there were 2 Leave campaigns. You had the official Vote Leave campaign run by Dominic Cummings. That was able to steer away from some of the more inflammatory language on immigration because they knew that the other campaign, Leave.eu, run by Nigel Farage, would go there.
When I first met Cummings, immigration, oh, no. We're not discussing that. No.
The Leave campaign, the mainstream designated Leave campaign, certainly at first at least didn't talk about reducing immigration, they talked about controlling immigration. From the moment that the ONS figures on immigration numbers came out at the end of May 2016, that changed.
Net migration to the UK has risen to its second highest level on record, according to the latest official figures.
Look at the immigration figures today. Look at the sheer numbers that are coming in. That needs to be got under control.
The real thing that swung the European Union referendum, and it was 333,000. There was the man, David Cameron, who said we'd get it down to the tens of thousands, leading the campaign, if you like, to remain in the European Union. He was finished from the time that statistic came out.
Is it not time we took back control of our immigration policy?
It felt a difficult argument because the fundamental point about free movement is you didn't have, any number of people from EU countries could come to Britain. And they had been coming in very large numbers.
On a Saturday afternoon, I was called up by the Sunday Times and told that there was going to be a 5,000-word letter penned by Michael Gove and Boris Johnson. And the headline that they were going to use was that David Cameron had been deeply disingenuous in saying that he wanted to cut net migration to the tens of thousands.
Two senior Conservatives, Boris Johnson and Michael Gove, have called on David Cameron to accept the failure of his pledge to cut immigration.
And I remember we were very deep into the campaign at this stage and phoning the Prime Minister. He was very angry, and he acted so much so that he put the phone down. And he called me up 3 minutes later and he said, I'm sorry about that, but I just can't believe that these two people, one of whom is godparent to my children, is claiming that I'm being deeply disingenuous about it. I'm not. I care about this. It's a huge issue. And yet, every opportunity, they're accusing me of being a liar.
I think one of the final points for me in terms of my views on immigration and Nigel was in relation to the breaking point poster. We'd won the argument. We didn't need to push it anymore. We didn't need to go down that line. I remember saying in a conversation with Nigel, I said, I don't think that was necessary to do that. And his view was it was absolutely necessary.
It's an extraordinarily incendiary poster to suggest Britain is somehow at breaking point because of migrants.
Well, what it says breaking point, and beneath it says the EU has failed us all.
Put it to you that we are not part of the Schengen area, and therefore these migrants are not coming to Britain, and it has nothing to do with EU migration into the UK.
The EU has failed us all.
That poster was coming out, and unfortunately we had Joe Cox die on the same day. I think he believed it was just unfortunate, but he believed that we needed to get the issue of immigration back out there, and I didn't.
The breaking point poster worked. Why? Because he got the argument back onto immigration in the last few days, and that was very difficult after the murder of Joe Cox.
It wasn't true to say that all the people fleeing Syria or fleeing war-torn countries were coming to Britain. They weren't.
Would you agree with Nigel Farage's poster this morning launch saying breaking point and that huge queue?
It's not our campaign, it's not my approach.
I think the official Leave campaign was happy that Nigel Farage existed. They were able to say, he's not part of us, he's over there, we can't take responsibility for him, while being very happy to travel in the slipstream of his borderline and sometimes overtly racist statements about what was going on in terms of migration. The breaking point poster, I think, was the object example of that.
I've been demonised for daring to talk about these subjects. I've never, ever, ever wanted any form of violence, any form of racist ideology.
The polls opened at 7 a.m. this morning, and the faces who dominated this referendum campaign were up early too.
I went to vote about 11 o'clock. A poll came out showing that Remain was 10 points ahead. I convinced myself we'd lose. You had to mentally prepare yourself to lose. And then, of course, we saw Newcastle and Sunderland and realised that it might be different.
The British people have spoken, and the answer is we're out.
I felt desperately disappointed. I felt I'd thrown everything I had into that campaign. I was 100% for the position I'd set out, and that's why I thought it was important to leave office afterwards. But obviously it was deeply, deeply disappointing.
If you're born poor, you will die on average 9 years earlier than others. If you're black, you're treated more harshly by the criminal justice system than if you're white. The government I lead will be driven not by the interests of the privileged few, but by yours.
The arrival of more than 400 happy Jamaicans. They've come to seek work in Britain and are ready and willing to do any kind of job that will help the motherland along the road to prosperity.
We came in 1961. I was 3 months old. So, yeah, we've been from the early stages until Mummy and Daddy managed to purchase a house in Hackney, and then my 2 younger siblings were born. I had always wanted to be a secretary. That's obviously why my parents paid for me to take private typing lessons. I worked for the NHS for a long time. My various other siblings got into other departments. It was like NHS, Post Office, London Transport, you know, or the police force. He said, no, you know, we're not happy with you not having a British passport. There's other people here who are looking for the work and who are British. And then I realized, wow, what are you saying to me? You know, this doesn't sound right. The only passport I've got is a Dominican passport, but I never thought I was illegal because I'm British. I got terminated from my job. I couldn't get benefits. I didn't have any money. I just couldn't understand.
The immigration officers rigorously screened the passengers. The questions were put kindly, but the answers were listened to keenly. Already, the Home Office's new instructions were being strictly carried out.
The Home Office has always been negative and unyielding on questions of migration. I first became aware of this issue because I do so much immigration casework. And it started to be a pattern that I was dealing with. The migrants which came before 1962 came as citizens of the United Kingdom and colonies. So as far as they knew, they had freedom of movement. But the hostile environment brought them up short. Suddenly the state was telling them that they weren't really British.
So I first became aware of it in October 2017. I went on to interview dozens of people affected by this who were wrongly classified by the Home Office as being illegal immigrants. And that erroneous classification impacted on their lives really catastrophically. The policy was predicated on an idea that the Home Office would be able to really clearly distinguish between who was in the country legally and who was in the country illegally. It became obvious that actually it's much harder to distinguish between people's immigration status than it sounds like in the abstract. Some people were detained and some people were wrongly deported to countries that they'd left as children decades before.
And he got stopped at the airport. So he's called me and he's panicking on the phone. They're not going to let me back into the country. And then 2 hours later, he came through the door and he said, they've only given me 2 months, Mum. So straight away, that just put him in a state of depression. And he just became depressed and I became depressed. And I did contemplate suicide because I thought it's my fault why I've got us both into this situation. I put us both in this, so if you take away me, then perhaps someone will listen to him.
Glenda is somebody whose life was really seriously affected by what happened. And I think her case, like so many of the other people we interviewed in The Guardian, really shows the extreme cruelty of the officials that she came into contact with. Before publication, you have to contact the Home Office and ask for a comment. And to begin with, the comments were quite blunt. So there was no sense of apology or unease, really, from the Home Office at all, just a sense that they were doing the correct work in trying to get people who were in the UK illegally out of the country.
So in late 2017, we started getting these reports through the media, The Guardian, of really terrible cases of people who had been badly treated. There was a response to them and ministers were involved. What we didn't do then, and what took far too long, was to understand that this was a systemic issue.
Thousands of people who arrived from the Caribbean with their parents after 1948 must now prove they have the right paperwork to remain here in the UK.
They came at the invitation of the British government. They were citizens of British colonies or newly independent Commonwealth countries. Their passports were stamped indefinite leave to remain. But for some who were children then, that was a false promise.
There's always a moment in a crisis when you realise that it's a crisis and the system, the organisational system, moves into a different gear. For me, in this case, that was on a Monday morning. Diaries were cleared. People were told that we had to focus on this above everything else. If only that had happened 3 months before, but it didn't.
How many have been detained as prisoners in their own country? This is a day of national shame, and it has come about because of a hostile environment policy that was begun under her Prime Minister.
I am concerned that the Home Office has become too concerned with policy and strategy and sometimes lose sight of the individual.
Both sides of this House need to accept the need for a proper debate about immigration. It's not just the Windrush generation, but it's generations over centuries of immigrants that have contributed in a positive way to all aspects of life in our country.
I got a call from my sister and she said to me, would you want to speak to, the media about it? And I went straight to my room and I got, the files that I had was that big and I was like, there you go.
You've been delegitimised as a British citizen.
It hurts me because I'm a mother of 4 British children, you know, and so why am I not British? What did I do wrong? I didn't do anything wrong and it's not my mistake. You know, it wasn't so much about me, it was more about my son, giving him his freedom in his own country. That's what he needed, his freedom in his own country. What we have to remember is that successive governments put this in place. It's not only one government, and I don't hold one political party responsible. I hold them all responsible. The hostile environment was one of the worst policies that ever came up because we shouldn't have been wrapped up in it. We were British citizens.
It is shameful that this government has treated this generation in this way.
It took far too long for the Home Office to recognise that these individual cases were not just injustices in their own right, but were part of a wider story of injustice that affected ultimately some thousands of people.
I was glad that in the end, belatedly, the Home Office was forced to address the issue. But sadly, very many victims still have not got their compensation.
I have just been to see Her Majesty the Queen, who has invited me to form a government, and I have accepted.
Now, in truth, nobody in the Home Office thought that made very much difference, because no government since 2010 had been able to achieve it.
We are very strongly opposed to Boris Johnson's decision to scrap the pledge to reduce immigration to 100,000.
Did you know Boris Johnson at all?
I've never met him. He has no useful policies on immigration, quite the reverse. It's very dangerous.
So can you guarantee that numbers will come down?
Yes, I can make sure that numbers will come down because we'll be able to control the system.
So once we had the Boris Johnson government in place, it was very clear that the message about control, Brexit enabling control of the border, the politicians seemed to be very happy that that was completely compatible with having potentially more. It wasn't about having fewer. Whether ministers chose to explain that quite so clearly to the public, I don't know.
I can barely remember immigration being debated in Cabinet during that period. Many of the greatest proponents of Brexit took their foot off the pedal. Some misread the Brexit referendum result and saw the public's demand merely for control, and that taking back control of the levers of immigration was an end in itself.
The May government had proposed a more liberal approach to people coming as skilled workers to the UK post-Brexit. But with the Johnson administration, that was effectively put on steroids.
Well, no one believes more strongly than me in the benefits of migration to our country. For years, politicians have promised the public an Australian-style points-based system, and today I will actually deliver on those promises.
Boris was always concerned about skilled labour, about making sure the city got the people it wanted, making sure manufacturing got the people it needed, and that's where the points-based system came from. We would allow numbers in up to a cap within the categories. That would enable us to have immigration that was necessary for the country's economy, but at the same time strengthen our position to say absolutely no to everybody else.
Immigration revolution is the big front page headline in the Mail.
Boris's border blueprint, we're told. I mean, no messing around.
The system that was created was neither points-based nor Australian. It did precisely the opposite of what politicians had argued during the referendum.
Policymakers couldn't have predicted the numbers of people who would be coming on the visa route, or the number of people that would be coming through the special schemes such as Hong Kong or Ukraine.
Net immigration from the rest of the world, the light blue line here, has risen sharply. Now, whether immigration from this source will remain high is unclear.
Immigration policy put in place after Brexit, in my view, was not the right one. I don't think treating EU neighbours in the same way as people coming from the other side of the world is good or sensible policy. You know, if people are coming over to work, if you're coming from Latvia or Poland or Spain, you're more likely to come over and work and then return home. If you're coming from Pakistan or West Africa or wherever, you're more likely to come, bring your family, and the pressure on public services grows.
If you look at the health and social care visa, the Home Office and the Department for Health estimated that the number of visas that would be issued was in the low thousands. It turned out, with dependents, to be in the hundreds of thousands. But there were also conscious decisions that were made, like bringing back the graduate route for university students to stay on post-study. Those were very bad decisions that essentially
stuck two fingers up to the British public. Decisions that were taken to create a post-Brexit immigration system that was more liberal than the one that we had when we were members of the European Union.
I think the criticism of the points-based system is a fair one. And I don't think it was really thought through, and the numbers were going up all the time. I certainly think that there should have been more work done by us as policy writers in trying to work out how we could actually get the numbers down.
It has become clear that the people who ran the Leave campaign, who were given an opportunity to run government and do something about migration, actually realised, look, this is a much more complicated problem than we thought.
Boris Johnson was the master of all he surveyed, with a huge mandate from voters. Today, he is on his way out.
And I want you to know how sad I am to be giving up the best job in the world.
Liz Truss will be Britain's next Prime Minister after she was declared the winner of the Conservative Party leadership contest. Thank you.
Liz Truss resigning as leader of the Conservative Party and therefore as Prime Minister.
Rishi Sunak is therefore elected as leader of the Conservative Party.
I entered the Home Office in a period of complete crisis. It was a burning building. There were hundreds of thousands of people coming into the country perfectly legally, and it was very apparent to me that we needed to do something entirely different.
Upon my appointment as Home Secretary, Rishi Sunak promised me that he understood the, again, crisis of unprecedented levels of visas being issued to workers, to low-wage workers, low-skilled workers, students, and their dependents coming into the country.
We had a record small boats crisis. Billions of pounds being wasted on hotels. The entire system was in chaos. Suella Braverman and I were completely aligned. We were of one mind on this.
So it came as no surprise to me that at the beginning of 2023, Rishi Sunak made stopping the boats one of his 5 key pledges, promises to the nation.
We will pass new laws to stop small boats, making sure that if you come to this country illegally, you are detained and swiftly removed.
I was encouraged by the commitment Rishi Sunak was demonstrating to this issue. His famous phrase was that he would do whatever it takes to stop the boats. I believed him then.
We've introduced unprecedented legislation to make clear that if you come here illegally, you will be detained and removed in weeks. I said I would stop the boats, and I meant it.
It was as if there was a sign on the White Cliffs of Dover, everyone welcome. I went out repeatedly. I told everybody there would be a massive number of people that came. The last Labour government deported illegal immigrants in their tens of thousands. It was respectable. Now if you deport one, you're a monster. This is how the centre of gravity of all these arguments has shifted. And Rishi was trying to wrestle it back. But it was more about rhetoric than it was about reality. It was more about telling the British public what they wanted to hear.
This is intentional policy because it makes a small problem look big. It's good for your image as staff, and you're really targeting the people who have strong views who might go and vote for UKIP.
We knew that immigration was a really big issue, and that had been obvious for a very, very long time, which is one of the reasons why Stop the Boats is one of those key pledges that the Prime Minister had put forward. So we didn't need to be pushed into this position. We were taking it seriously.
So if you could take those asylum seekers out of the hotel up the road and put them on a plane to Rwanda, you would?
Exactly.
We need to take ownership of the fact these are people in our country, and we need to process their claims as quickly as possible.
We had issued 1.1 million work and study visas. We'd never done that before. So this was, totally at odds with our manifesto pledge and an undermining of the Brexit referendum vote in 2016. I made all these points to Rishi Sunak. He promised me that he would support me in the measures that would be needed. It became quickly apparent that those were false promises.
Back in 2019, the government promised to cut net migration. At the time, it was 226,000. It's gone up. The forecasts say it will continue to climb to between 650,000 and nearly 1 million. Will it go down next year?
But what I can tell you is I want to bring the numbers of legal net migration down.
He put forward the argument that mass migration was a good thing because undercutting British workers' wages was helping to bring down inflation. I was shocked, and I completely disagreed with that approach.
The broader objection that I would get from the Prime Minister and from the Chancellor of the Exchequer and other ministers was that if we were going to cut immigration, then we would be actually cutting revenue.
There has been a fundamental dishonesty about immigration policy, which is many of the economic departments in government want more immigrants because they recognise that immigration is necessary for the workforce, that it's good for growth and so on. Whilst the Home Office's line tends to be, we want to stop immigration. And governments have been perfectly content to let those two narratives just sit side by side without explaining any of the trade-offs to the public.
One conversation I had went along the lines of, well, Suella, if you want to halve net migration to 300,000, you realise that's going to cost us £3 billion. That's the same as a tax cut to income tax. Prime Minister, I would say, let me just do what's necessary to lower immigration. It's so easy. We don't need to pass an act of parliament. We don't need to worry about the House of Lords. We don't need to worry about the European Court of Human Rights. But as long as the Prime Minister refused to support me, my hands were tied.
The Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak, has sacked his Home Secretary, Suella Braverman.
It's a really extraordinary end to her tumultuous tenure as Home Secretary under Rishi Sunak.
I felt that many others simply wanted to create a symbolic policy. I remember a particular cabinet meeting in late November, and I looked around the room and felt that I was the only person there who was genuinely pressing for a policy which would work. And I left that meeting, I walked out into Downing Street, and at that point I knew that I'd have to resign.
Particularly under the Sunak government, you had this steady drumbeat on the right of unhappiness with levels of legal migration, whilst at the same time 700,000 plus people were getting visas to come here under the government's own policy. So this, in a sense, encapsulates what I mean by dishonesty, is sounding unhappy about the direct consequence of policies you yourself have put in place.
The great strategic error of the Conservative Party of the last 14 years has not been to address the issue of immigration, but actually to tell people consistently that it can solve it. And at every turn, it has doubled down in telling people we can solve this problem. That has then resulted in the Conservative Party saying even more desperate things like, why don't we create a deterrent like putting people into Rwanda? They've become obsessed by the issue. It's costing a fortune. Nobody really seriously believes that it's actually going to make a huge difference in terms of cutting migration, and yet they're on the hook for that.
I certainly think, we did not do enough over the time in government to bring in a proper controlled system for immigration that benefited Britain and that people had faith in.
A new Prime Minister and a new beginning, says Labour, as Keir Starmer sweeps to a landslide election victory. Reform's first MP and first victory tonight. We're going to hear Lee Anderson now.
I want my country back, and National can play their part in that. Thank you.
So they will be able to make a moral case that they are making an imprint in British politics.
I believe that the population explosion is having the biggest impact on the quality of life of ordinary folk than any other issue. Even the net figure is a migrant a minute. I think for anyone that believes that somehow this issue will gently go away, I don't think the debate's even started.
More than 100 people were arrested in London, Hartlepool and Manchester overnight.
There is no excuse for the violent, none whatsoever. And the people that have engaged in that should be dealt with, and dealt with firmly. But also to basically write off everyone involved as being a kind of, far right, because the vast majority of people were not. Writing them off in that way means the government is now less likely to listen to the genuine concerns that are interwoven in some illegitimate concerns.
I don't buy the argument that people were attacking mosques, trying to burn down hotels with asylum seekers in, and beating up people of colour on the street. I don't buy the argument that that was down to legitimate grievances. My own constituency in Hackney, some of them have similar legitimate grievances. They're not beating up black people.
I have always accepted that concerns about immigration are legitimate. It is, as point of fact, the policy of this government to reduce both net migration and our economic dependency upon it. It is my personal mission to smash the people smuggling gangs. No more gimmicks, no more gesture politics, no more irresponsible, undeliverable promises.
It's become a sort of crude argument where some people say, well, you've got an open door on immigration, and other people say, you're anti-immigrant. It's a hopeless argument that you'll never resolve in that way. You resolve it by a system of control.
One of the people I worked with, she said to me once, how can they hate us so much when they don't even know us? And my answer was, because they don't know us, maybe we need to do more to come forward and speak, tell our own stories, engage with people, engage with the debate in order to change things.
Just you watch. This issue's going to get bigger and bigger.
What are the impacts of recent changes to UK citizenship? Explore the Open University's stories of two fictional families by scanning the QR code on screen now or visiting bbc.co.uk/immigration and following links to the Open University.